right, guys, so today we are going to cover Chapter 12, Movements of Vertebrate Species. It's a good one. So we know that vertebrates are mobile animals. They move about to secure food, to locate suitable home sites and nesting sites, to avoid unfavorable times of year, and to find mates. Orientation consists of two different phenomena for these guys. It helps to control the animal's position in space and to control an animal's path through space. So we'll talk a little later about all the ways that, that vertebrates are able to orient in space. Vertebrate movements can be categorized into the basis of where and when they occur. Home range movements, dispersal, invasions, migration, homing, and immigration. And so we'll talk about each one of those. And also movements can be classified by the mechanisms in which they are achieved: vision, hearing, olfaction, navigation, and compass orientation. And we'll cover those as well. So let's talk a little bit about home range movements. So the area around the home of an individual organism is where its normal activities of gathering food, mating, and caring for its young occur. Home ranges can be all sorts of shapes and sizes. They can be linear, two-dimensional, three-dimensional in space. They often correlate in size with the size of the animal. Of course, carnivores have larger home ranges than herbivores. Specialists tend to have larger home ranges than generalists. Polygamous species may also have larger home ranges than monogamous species. And species in marginal habitats need larger home ranges than those in high quality habitat. And sometimes the home range size will decrease with increasing population size as competition becomes more fierce. Under normal conditions, a lot of animals have permanent ranges and spend their entire lives in those areas. So most frogs, salamanders, lizards, turtles, snakes, moles, woodchucks, deer mice, and lots of others establish permanent home ranges. And those ranges are usually established after those organisms disperse from their natal areas. Of course, migratory species like sea turtles, birds, elks have summer home ranges where they reproduce and care for the young, and then also winter ranges in a different area that allows them to avoid adverse conditions and survive. Ranges are often marked, and vertebrates use lots of different means for marking their home ranges. They use glandular secretions, urine, excrement, and place those strategically around the outside of the range. And the home within the home range often serves as refuge for the organism, a refuge from enemies and competitors. It may be in the form of underground burrow or a cave, a tree cavity, a rotting log, an arboreal nest, or a brush pile. The home can serve for an individual or for a family or even for a colony within vertebrate species. So some vertebrates actively defend a portion of their home range, and the defended area is known as a territory. It contains the home within the territory site. Generally, a vertebrate organism is considered to be territorial if it has exclusive use of an area. And often availability of food can influence territorial behavior. The size of the territory. The size of the territory can vary temporally So in different seasons, it may be different sizes, and also from location to location, depending on the quality of that habitat. And territoriality is one of the most important behaviors that affects the organization of animal populations in space and also population dynamics. So territorial behavior forces some individuals into suboptimal habitat. The defended area is usually smaller than the home range, but in some species, they are one and the same. And I've put a link to a great video of a territorial encounter in two African bullfrogs that's really kind of fun to watch. So dispersal and invasion. Dispersal refers to the movement of an animal from its birthplace to the place where it reproduces. And that type of movement usually happens before sexual maturity, and it takes place in all vertebrate groups. It tends to be the male that disperses, but in some cases, it's both the male and the female. And there are maybe thought to be three advantages of this sort of behavior. One, it encourages outbreeding in the population and helps to avoid inbreeding within the population. So it encourages genetic diversity for animals to disperse away from natal sites. It permits range expansion for that vertebrate species, and it may contribute to re-invasion or reoccupation of formerly occupied areas to have members of the population pushing out. In a lot of species, dispersal can be density dependent. So there's a tendency to move only when the population numbers are high, and if aggression is shown within the population, and sometimes by the parents towards their offspring. And then other species seem to have an innate predisposition to travel away from the natal area. A really interesting dispersal / invasion story is the story of the cattle egret, which was native to Africa and crossed on its own power and was first reported in South America in 1877. So it traveled a distance of over 2,800 miles across open ocean for about 40 hours. And these guys have successfully invaded North and South America at this point with the range expansion being tracked. You can look at in this map. A little bit about migration. So migration is the periodic movement of a population to, or a part of a population from a region, and their subsequent return to that region later in time. So the length of migration trips really vary from species to species, with some species traveling alone, some species traveling in large groups. Migratory movements can be daily, they can be seasonal, they can be irregular, they can occur annually, as in the case of birds and mammals, or they can require a lifetime to complete, as is true with salmon and freshwater eels. So short distance migration or local migration is typical in some salamanders that migrate from their subterranean hibernacula to, say, a breeding pond to reproduce. Mule deer in the western mountains move from their summer ranges on north-facing slopes to their wintering ground on south-facing slopes. And we see similar short distance migration with altitudinal migration, so migration up and down an elevation gradient. That also can be seasonal or daily. We know that elk spend their summer months in high mountain meadows and their winter months lower in valleys on the valley floor. Another example from my part of the world are the dark-eyed juncos and Carolina chickadees of the southern Alps that also migrate altitudinally and migrate just several thousand feet in elevation during the seasons. Long distance migration. Lots of species of birds, waterfowl, including ducks, geese, swans, cranes, are well-known long-distance migrants. Passerine species, vireos, warblers, flycatchers, and swallows and thrushes are also well-known for their long-distance migrations. Of 650 North American migratory bird species, 51% spend 6 to 9 months out of the year in the tropics of the Americas. A lot of migratory birds use four major flyways in North America: the Atlantic Flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, the Central Flyway, and the Pacific Flyway. And since the flyway concept was established in 1935, there have been studies that show that species migration is a good bit more diffuse than initially thought when that concept came to be. The distance of migratory journeys for vertebrate species is incredible, both in their length and in their duration. So we talked about salmon when we talked about fish. Pacific salmon breed in freshwater streams, and their young migrate to sea. And after 2 to 4 years, they travel back to the river system in which they were born. And those fish will cover several thousand kilometers during their migratory travels. Eels that spawn in the Sargasso Sea, the larvae or immature glass eels move up estuaries in both America and Europe, and they spend 8 to 25 years reaching sexual maturity before returning to those breeding areas in the marine environment. Other fish species show incredible examples of migration across huge expanses, including some shark species and also the blue marlin. And of course, sea turtles are well known for their migratory behavior and returning to natal sites. One female sea turtle tagged with a satellite transmitter was tracked on a journey of 4,900 miles over 2 years before the battery ran out. Studies of loggerhead sea turtles show that they recognize their position on Earth using the magnetic field. And although that has been difficult to test in some species, we'll talk a little bit more about navigation in a moment. So just a few patterns of bird migration. Shorebirds, and like many of our waterfowl, nest in the Arctic tundra and migrate to southern wintering grounds. So unlike waterfowl, many shorebirds, sandpipers, plovers, godwits, curlews, actually migrate beyond the confines of the North American continent. So pictured here, we have the lesser golden plover, which spends the northern winter on the Argentinian grasslands. And there, along with some of its fellow migrants, the plover spends the summer months with resident South American shorebirds. And the spring, the golden plover migrates northward in flocks, crossing the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They enter the United States, mainly along the Texas and Louisiana coast. They head up through the interior of North America, stopping to feed on insects in pastures and plowed fields in the migratory, in the agricultural Midwest. And these long distance migrants arrive on their breeding grounds in June. They nest during the summer. And then young birds are precocial and capable of flight at birth. And because there's actually little parental care seen in these guys. The adult birds depart on their southward migration before summer's over, and weeks before the young actually begin their trip. So just a fascinating strategy of a long distance migrant in these guys. Seabirds are also well adapted for covering huge expanses over seemingly trackless ocean. And as migrants go, they really hold the record. The Arctic tern nests as far north as open land exists and travels the length of the ocean to winter at the other end of the world. Its round trip is about 25,000 miles that it performs every year of its lifetime. So most truly oceanic, more truly oceanic birds include shearwaters, albatross, storm petrels, who spend most of their lives out of sight of land, coming ashore really only to nest. So pictured there is the sooty shearwater that nests on islands deep in the southern hemisphere, mostly around New Zealand and the southern tip of South America, and that spend their winters at temperate North America latitudes. And then last are migratory land birds, including all of our passerines. So it's a common misconception that many of our North American summer land birds go to South America for the winter. What the evidence shows us is that actually these migrants were likely tropical birds that slowly moved northward to gain access to areas with less competition and less protection to raise their young. So lots of species of sparrows, juncos, towhees actually stay in the United States and migrating only as far as is necessary to find winter weather that's less severe. But many other land birds, tanagers, warblers, orioles, the list goes on and on, are actually neotropical migrants that leave North America for Central and South America for the winter. A little bit about migration height in birds. So with the help of radar, we have a sense of the altitude of migration. We know that songbirds, small passerines will migrate at about 5,000 feet, and the majority of that travel may be no higher than 2,500 feet, whereas waterfowl and shorebirds migrate closer to 10,000 feet or even as high as 20,000 feet. And of course, bird-plane collisions at some of those higher altitudes is a serious concern for aviation. What fuels migration? It's interesting and actually to observe the amount of fuel that birds will put on before their migratory journey. So remember that fat yields about twice as much energy and water per gram than do carbohydrates or protein. So fat storage is extremely important for some of these migratory species. And we actually see birds storing fat under the skin and the muscles and organs, in cavities within the body, which is essential for them to be able to make their trip. A little bit about mammal migration. Among mammals, elephant seals and whales migrate the longest distances annually. Northern elephant seals migrate each year between the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California and Mexico's Baja California, northward to the Gulf of Alaska. Research on humpback whales in both the northern and southern hemispheres has reported site-specific male-biased sex ratios on breeding grounds. Ungulate migration in the United States includes mule deers who migrate 150 miles across Wyoming, crossing highways and fences, and caribous, pictured here, make one of the longest migratory journeys of any ungulate in North America. And then, of course, in Africa, we see huge herds of gazelles, wildebeests, and others traveling many kilometers annually in search of food and water. A little bit about how vertebrates actually navigate. And the answer is lots of ways. So we know that some species use their sense of taste and smell. Some use their sense of sight and the presence of landmarks. Some species use celestial bodies and the Earth's magnetic field. So all of these mechanisms allow species like salmon and birds to travel back to precise locations after covering hundreds of thousands of miles over their lifetime. And some of the mechanisms for this have been really debated over the years. So olfaction, celestial cues, sounds, vision, the Earth's magnetic field all appear to be involved for various species. They've actually found permanent magnetic iron oxide concentrated in the head and neck muscles of some migratory and actually non-migratory birds. It's thought that that iron base creates crystals that align like a tiny compass, sending a signal to the brain to help gauge the strength and direction of the magnetic field. Birds are thought to have at least 3 independent magnetic field detectors in their heads, one associated with the pineal gland, one in the eye, which requires light to function, and a third transducer that's not completely understood. So to explain the phenomenon of navigation in birds and other vertebrates, we talk about something called the map and compass theory. The compass component of this theory is what gives the animal direction. So how do they tell north, south, east, west? The map component gives the bird its locality. So how do they know where they are in the world in relation to where they might want to go? So scientists have learned a lot more about the compass component than they have about the mapping component. They know that birds have several means of determining compass direction, but they don't really have a perfect biological explanation of the map that guides birds from an unfamiliar starting point back to an exact location. The picture on this slide is an ink pad at the bottom of a cone with a bird in it, and the bird here is ready to start its migratory journey. It is clearly orienting itself in the direction it would normally fly for spring migration in a dark room with, no other visual clues that would give it that compass direction. Just an interesting experiment showing that compass theory. Other species, we see fish homing. Fish may use gradients of temperature, salinity, or chemicals in the water. They may use the sun's orientation or the orientation of polarized light on the water, and also orientation using the geomagnetic and geoelectric fields. Amphibians, we believe, use chemical, visual, and celestial cues as well as the Earth's magnetic field. The moon and the stars are thought to be important primarily for migratory birds and for some bats. where the sun is used by a lot of diurnal migrants. Celestial bodies would be used by night migrants. And then some species, we see emigration. So some vertebrates engage in movement away from occupied areas. Such one-trip trips are known as emigration, leaving a population to disperse to a new area. Sometimes you see this in examples where there's overpopulation. And one of the examples that the book describes is of lemming populations. When populations reach a critical mass, there have been massive events of emigration out of the population. I have an extended trailer here of an incredible film on bird migration that might be fun to watch. It's a 10-minute extended trailer. If you're able to get your hands on the actual feature film, I highly recommend it. And a few discussion review questions for you guys. And that wraps it up for vertebrate movements.